This is Terry Beatley, your host of What If We've Been Wrong? I'm shining light into some dark places so that beauty, goodness, and truth defeat the schemes of the enemy. It's true, people are perishing for lack of knowledge, and we're instructed to have nothing to do with the evil deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. That's what I do on What If We've Been Wrong? Rethink, explore, and uncover some hidden truths so that more people can experience an abundant life and the joy of being set free from the shackles that hold us in prison. Welcome to What If We've Been Wrong? All right, today I have a super interesting show, and it has to do with Reggie Littlejohn. She's the president and founder of Women's Rights Without Frontiers. That's a diverse international coalition of individuals and organizations which are united in their belief that forced abortion and sexual slavery in the country of China must be stopped. And I think you're going to be interested in this show because we're going to be shining light in all sorts of dark places. And Reggie is like boots on the ground, and she's got a network, and she is super connected. She knows what's going on. And she's going to enlighten us today about what it's really like to be a woman over in China today. And so, Reggie, thanks for coming on to What If We've Been Wrong?
Oh, thank you so much, Terry, for having me.
Well, let's start digging deep. So first off, the name of your organization is Women's Rights Without Frontiers. So let's just, I've given an introduction sentence about it, but what do you do? And of course I want to get into, how in the world did you ever get involved in all of this?
Well, Women's Rights Without Frontiers is an international women's rights organization, and we are focused on what I think has been the biggest women's rights issue in the world, which is the forced abortion of women under China's one-child policy, now two-child policy. The Chinese Communist Party has boasted that it has prevented 400 million lives through the one-child policy. That number is greater than the entire population of the United States and Canada combined. And then the sex-selective abortion of baby girls is also rampant in China. So we have been on the forefront of exposing these atrocities and opposing them. And the way that we have exposed them is that I'm an international expert on the one-child policy. I've testified 8 times at the United States Congress. I've testified at the European Parliament, the British Parliament, the Irish Parliament, the Canadian Parliament. I have been a keynote speaker for the Walk for Life in San Francisco, the National Right to Life. I was the keynote speaker for the National Pro-Life Walk in Canada, and I've been interviewed by Dr. James Dobson and C-SPAN and all kinds of, so in other words, there's an advocacy campaign, and our advocacy campaign has been incredibly successful. So, for example, we were the organization that has been the loudest and most persistent ever since I started this organization, which was about 2008. I started doing this work. My very first press release was called "You Are Funding Forced Abortions in China, So Am I." And it was an exposure of the fact that the United States has been funding the UNFPA, the United Nations Family Planning Fund, and International Planned Parenthood, which have been working hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party in their coercive birth control since the beginning. We have been just persistently advocating that the U.S. defund that, and President Trump, when he came into office, finally defunded it. So we were ecstatic about that.
Right, that's fantastic. And I remember when that hit the news.
Yeah,
right.
And it was, so we were kind of almost alone in our praise of him, at least among the women's rights organizations, because the Washington Post ran an article about this and saying how terrible it was, and quoting all these people about how devastating this was. And it says, and then at the end it says, but Reggie Littlejohn says this is a great move, and all the reasons why. So we were kind of a lonely voice on that, but I think that it's wonderful that we defunded it, because as long as we were funding it, as far as I'm concerned, the blood of the Chinese women and babies was on our hands, and now it's not anymore. So thank,
right.
President for that.
Okay, well, not everybody understands about this forced abortion business over in China. Just walk us, pretend people are listening right now, and this is all new to them, Reggie. You know, I mean, maybe they know, yeah, but China, they have a lot of abortions or whatever, and they population control. What was going on under the one-child policy? Just walk us through that. What do you mean forced abort? Do you mean it literally, forced abortion? Walk us through that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean it literally. Okay, so let me just give you the history. So under the Mao era, Chairman Mao had said that people are the strength of China, and the average fertility under the Mao era was 6 kids per woman. Then when Deng Xiaoping came into power, he actually started an encouragement program saying 3 kids is too many, 2 is okay, 1 is best. And even under that, just an encouragement program, the fertility rate dropped dramatically. But then for whatever reason, he decided that this was not dramatic enough, and he instituted the one-child policy. And I'm telling you, Terry, this is a situation where women have been dragged out of their homes, strapped down to tables, and forced to abort babies that they want up to the 9th month of pregnancy. And some of these forced abortions have been so violent that the women themselves have died along with their full-term babies. So this is what I'm saying is that when you look at the numbers, 400 million, and then about 200 million forced sterilizations, just because of the numbers involved, this is the greatest violation of women's rights, not only in the world today, but in the history of the earth. So,
and I look at this as a woman. You know, even obviously you and I are totally pro-life and we want to see an end to abortion, but even women on the other side of this issue in America, they should be rallying behind you. If they're for women's rights, I mean, Reggie, they should be rallying behind women's rights without frontiers. Because this, I can't even imagine. I cannot even imagine a poor woman who wants to keep her baby and they drag her out of her home. I mean, I have read articles before where if it's a late term, I mean, they will shoot saline through her abdomen into the womb, and I mean, then begins that kind of an abortion, a saline abortion. This is horrible. So, have you talked to many of these Chinese women?
Well, okay. Before we get to that, I want to address the point that you just brought up, which is that the people who are supposedly pro-choice should be jumping up and down against forced abortion, and they're not. Okay.
Right. Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
So, and Women's Rights Without Frontiers was meant to be a coalition of people who are pro-choice and pro-life, because no one supports forced abortion because it's not a choice.
Right.
But the so-called pro-choice movement has completely shied away from taking any kind of a consistent stand against forced abortion in China. And to me, what that does is it makes me wonder what their true agenda is. Are they really pro-choice? I mean, if they really were pro-choice, they would be totally opposed to this. Or are they merely saying that they're pro-choice, but actually what they really are is they are pro-population control, and
right.
They are willing to look the other way even when women are forcibly aborted.
Exactly. Have you gotten feedback from anybody on the other side of this issue? I mean, do you have support from people who are pro-choice and they're just like, this forced abortion stuff is terrible?
Well, just a little bit. So, I've gotten a couple of contributions from people who are pro-choice, and have said, I'm pro-choice, and I support you because you're stopping forced abortion in China. But it's always been like individuals or very small groups. So I believe that the individuals who say that they're pro-choice, most of those people really are pro-choice. Okay. But I think that the organizations like NOW and NARAL and all the rest of those ones, Planned Parenthood, this pro-choice, they have not taken a stand. And even when horrible things have come across, they have not taken a stand. And I believe that my question is, are you really pro-choice or are you just pro-population control? Okay?
Exactly. Well, I mean, the other thing is when China brags about 400 million people have been what is it?
Prevented.
Yeah, prevented from ever being born. You're talking about 50% of those are little baby girls. So my question is, how is aborting 200 million baby girls, women's health care and all of this? It's an assault on women, and all women, I believe, should get behind Women's Rights Without Frontiers and support your efforts. Now, I'm just curious, to what degree do you ever get to know any of the women? Have you met some of these women who have been forcibly, undergone abortion?
Well, sure. I mean, there are women who escaped China and are brave enough to testify before Congress. So the first time I testified before Congress was in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And I testified. One of the other people who was testifying was a woman who called herself Wu Jian. And she was so worried about the repercussions against her family in China that she testified with a black shroud around her head and behind a privacy screen. And Wu Jian, of course, is a pen name. That's not her real name.
Mm-hmm.
And she had an absolutely horrendous forced abortion. I think it was 6 or 7 months. She called it, her testimony, she called it "my little foot, my lifelong pain." And so what happened to her was she, had, I guess, either she was or was not married. This is one of the problems in China. People can go through a single woman cannot have a baby. That's illegal. But the definitions of marriage are different between the population and the police, the family planning police. So whereas in a town, a couple could go through the whole cultural wedding, and then the young woman can go with the young man and start living with the young man's family, which is what happens when you get married in rural China. Mm-hmm. And the whole community considers them to be married, but they are so poor they could not afford a marriage license, and therefore they did not get a birth permit. And therefore, when they get pregnant, it's illegal.
Oh my God!
She was with her husband and living with his family, and the family planning police found out about it. So she went into hiding. She lived in some remote place in this little shack without running water, without electricity. Her husband would come and leave her a bag of groceries every week. And that was how she tried to maintain that pregnancy. And then one of their neighbors came up, found out where she was, came to her and said, "Look, I just want you to know, Wu Jian, they're beating your father-in-law to a pulp because you escaped. And if you do not allow yourself to have a forced abortion, they're going to kill him." Okay. So she was in this little shack, dying 1,000 deaths, trying to think, okay, what do I do? Do I save the life of my baby? Do they save the life of my father-in-law? Can you imagine having to make a decision like that? And in the midst of this agony that she was in, the family planning police found out where she was, came and grabbed her, brought her, in a van with other women who they had rounded up for forced abortions, took her to to some kind of a facility where there are all these women in various stages of forced abortion, rolling on the floor and just, and they gave her baby that saline injection, which is they inject saline they try to inject it into the skull of the baby to kill the baby.
Oh gosh.
And her baby stopped moving, but then it did not come out. So she was there for 2 days with her dead baby inside of her.
Oh my God.
For 2 days, they said, "You know what? You are giving us so much trouble." And they took her into this operating room, and there were bloody handprints on the wall, and they dismembered her baby. And in the end, the nurse showed her, I don't know why the nurse did this. The nurse took her tweezers and showed her the foot of her baby, the dismembered foot of her baby. Why she called it? So this is something that is just is crushing. It's just crushing. You never get over it. She said she would much rather have died than to have lived that experience.
Well, and I think as an American and as an American woman and as American women, we should care. We should care about our sisters across the world who are having to endure. I mean, to me, it would have to be the greatest injustice. I mean, other than like being murdered, but to be held down and to be forced for that to happen, I think it's just an atrocity. So you're out in the public sphere. You're testifying around the world. Let's see. But what is your organization? What does it do inside China? I know you can't disclose everything, but in general, what are you doing right there in China?
So we do international advocacy, which has been very effective. And one of the most recent things that happened is that China has announced that they are going to stop the two-child policy. Inside of China, we have a network that does two things. Number one, we save baby girls from sex-selective abortion, and number two, we save elderly widows who've been just completely abandoned under the one-child policy.
Okay, all right. So we have just enough time to get into about this sex selection abortion. So we've got about a minute and a half. Tell us a little bit about that in China. What's going on there?
Well, China is one of a number of countries that has a strong son preference. And so because of the one-child policy and even under the two-child policy, people would find out through ultrasound what the gender of their baby was. Or if you're in a poor area and don't have access to ultrasound, they would just give birth to the baby. And if it was a girl, they would either abort her if they were in a richer area and had access to abortion, or they would just leave her out in a field to die if they were in a poorer area and just they did not have access to abortion.
And you mean it literally. They leave the baby out in the field and the baby will die under the elements and probably be eaten by wolves or bears or whatever they have there. Okay.
Right. No, yes, it's quite literally true. It's called giving her up. So, so mothers-in-law typically will pressure their daughters-in-law to give up their baby girl, and that can mean actually giving her or selling her to a childless couple. Sometimes it means that, and sometimes it means just putting her in a little box and leaving her by the river, which, we have documentary evidence of that happening.
Right. Okay. Well, I think most people have no clue about this, and they certainly didn't know about the high numbers. And I just, before we stop with this harbor, I just really want to encourage people to learn more by going onto your website, reading your blog. You've got a great blog where you can really keep people up to date. And then, figure out a way maybe where they can help you. Now, when we come back, we're going to be talking more about the forced sex selection, that's happening in China. But I also want to get into your two different, the two things you're running, Save a Girl and Save a Widow. How can people do that? And then I want to know more about the boots on the ground. What are they doing there for your organization to whatever degree you can share? So we will be right back. Don't go anywhere.
The goal is to deliver a message of truth, inspiration, and hope to the world, to unite people from all backgrounds and beliefs in an effort to advance humanity. News blogs, informative podcasts, and entertaining videos. It's AmericaOutloud.com, where the conversation never ends, with 24/7 streaming on our free apps on both Android and Apple. Welcome to the new era in communications, America Out Loud Talk Radio.
All right, we're back with Reggie Littlejohn with Women's Rights Without Frontiers, and we're talking about all this, the large-scale abortion that's happening in China, and so unfairly against women who want to keep their babies, and they're forced into abortion, and how China used to have the one-child policy, and they've recently liberalized it. I put that in quote marks to a two-child policy. But before we get into all that, I forgot to ask you, Reggie, in that first segment, how in the world did you get involved in all this? This is so unusual. You're one single American woman, and you're just rocking the world. So how did you get involved?
Well, I'll tell you what. It was a bigger surprise to me than to anyone else. I mean, I never thought I would be involved with this. So I'm a lawyer. I am a graduate of Yale Law School. I was a litigator in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, an intellectual property and complex commercial litigator. And I also represented Chinese refugees in their cases for political asylum in the United States. And my first refugee was someone who had been persecuted as a Christian and forcibly sterilized under the one-child policy. And so this was in the mid-90s that I represented her. What I mean by forcibly sterilized is she had had 2 children. They wanted to sterilize her. These forced sterilizations are not carried out by highly trained gynecological surgeons. They are trained out by, you and I could probably have as much training as these people get in 2 weeks, all right, out in the countryside. And so they just butcher these women. So my client did not want to have this sterilization because other women in her village had been completely their entire health was ruined by these sterilizations. So cadres, like a dozen cadres, would come to her door every day wanting to sterilize her, and she refused and refused. So they finally physically picked her up, dragged her out of her home, screaming and pleading, held her down to a table, sliced her open, tied her fallopian tubes, without anesthesia.
Oh my God.
Okay? And sure enough, just like other people in her village, she got a massive infection, and she had chronic back pain, chronic abdominal pain, and chronic migraines, probably for the rest of her life. From the time that she had the surgery to the time that she came to the United States and met me, it had been chronic, and I don't see any reason that it's not continuing. Right. So that's how I found out about it. And I remember sitting in my beautiful office in this very nice law firm on a beautiful day in San Francisco, thinking to myself, here I am living the American dream.
Right.
And I can't believe that on the other side of the earth, at this very moment, women are being dragged out of their homes, strapped down to tables, and forcibly aborting babies that they want. I just can't believe that this is happening. So then, in 2003, I got very, very sick, and I had to leave the legal profession on a medical leave of absence. And what happened basically is I had to have bilateral mastectomies with implant reconstruction, which is usually about 2 months off of work. But I got an MRSA staph infection, like implanted into my body during the surgery.
Oh dear.
And I couldn't control it, and it was just a horrible mess. And there was a time when my husband and I didn't know whether I would live or whether I would die. These things can be fatal. And so during that time, I went basically overnight from being a high-powered litigation supervising attorney to being someone who was flat on my back, begging God to spare my life. And I prayed to God to break my heart for whatever breaks his heart. And immediately my mind went to the women and the babies of China. So during that time, and I was disabled for 5 years, God turned me around 180 degrees from using the skills that I had learned as a litigation attorney representing the biggest software companies in the world, okay, in venture company litigation, turned all those skills to advocating on behalf of the women and the babies of China. Wow. And that's how Women's Rights Without Frontiers was born.
Reggie, I'm in tears just listening to how God called you into this, and plus you were sick for 5 years. It's incredible. No, you've already set, a beautiful example of a woman who's standing for truth, because you know that the women in America who are pro-choice minded, that they have you've given them every single reason to get behind you, to stand with you, and to say no more, and to help our sisters over in China. I mean, because it's just so wrong. Okay, so that's how you got involved. So what was your first step? So it's like, okay, God, I'm going to go help the women in China. What did you do? Did you pack your bag, or what did you do?
Okay. Terry, listen to this. This whole thing is just so crazy. I never thought I'd be doing this. Okay, so first thing the Lord put on my heart was, I said to him, Lord, I am a woman of action. What do you want me to do? I'm a lawyer. I could go back and be an international human rights lawyer. And the Lord, I felt that the Lord was putting it on my heart to write a screenplay. Mm-hmm. Like, what? Write a screenplay? Mm-hmm. I don't know how to write a screenplay. And I felt like impressed that the Lord was saying, my grace is sufficient for you, and my strength is made perfect in your weakness. Woo. So He chose something I have no idea how to do. And I'm telling you that writing this screenplay was like giving birth. It was a very close partnership with the Lord. I mean, I was praying, I was on my face in prayer, I was fasting through the writing of this screenplay. And when I was done, I submitted it to a couple of script consultants who helped me get it down from 240 pages to 110 pages. Mm-hmm. And submitted it to some screenwriting contests, and it just started winning these contests. And these are secular contests. So anyway, the script is called Pearls of China, and I would love to make it into a movie, but that's a whole other story. So in the process of doing this, and researching this screenplay, I got on the websites of every Chinese human rights organization I could find. Mm-hmm. And so on one of those, the organization, what they did is they did Chinese human rights in front of the European Parliament. And they sent out an email to everybody saying, this is 2008, and they said, we're having a conference at the European Parliament about human rights in China in connection with the Olympics in Beijing. As you remember, the Olympics were in Beijing in 2008. Mm-hmm. Here's our list of experts, and here's our list of issues. And I did something I never have done before. I emailed the president, and I said, great list of experts, great list of issues. How come no one's talking about the one-child policy? And the president of that organization emailed me back and said, Ms. Littlejohn, don't you realize that the coercive enforcement of the one-child policy is a thing of the past? And I said, oh, really? Well, and this is when my litigation instincts kicked in. Yeah. What about this document? What about this document? What about this document? What about this document? What about this? And finally he wrote back and said, Ms. Littlejohn, you've convinced me. I surrender.
I love it. Hold on. I've just got to add in something here. I'm looking at Blessed Pope Paul VI's letter to women dated December 8, 1965. And he was writing this letter to women all around the world. And it ends like this. He says, women, you do know how to make truth sweet, tender, and accessible. Make it your task to bring the spirit of this council into institutions, schools, homes, and daily life. Women of the entire universe, whether Christian or non-believing, you to whom life is entrusted at this grave moment in history, it is for you to save the peace of the world. And I'm thinking, Reggie's doing it. Reggie's doing it. I got my own little thing going on myself, with Jose Initiative, but Reggie's doing it. It's just beautiful. I love it. Okay, keep on. Okay, so you blow the lid off, and this guy is speechless, and he's like, okay, now what happens?
So he said, will you be our expert and come to testify before the European Parliament at our expense, and be the first person ever to testify about the one-child policy? And I about just fell off of my chair. I couldn't believe it. So I said yes, and I went and I testified at the European Parliament, and it turns out that I was the first person ever to pull together, and again, this is my legal analysis, the causal connections between all of the unintended consequences of the one-child policy. So you've got the forced abortion and the forced sterilization, which leads to infanticide, which leads to genocide, the sex-selective abortion of baby girls, which leads to this gender imbalance where there's 37 million more men living in China than women, which leads to human trafficking and sexual slavery. No one had put it together like that before, and my testimony was put in a book about human rights in China. Wow. And from that moment on, I was like the world expert on the one-child policy, which is so funny because I had never intended that.
But we serve an awesome God, so God had it all. He had it all masterminded.
Well, I mean, there's some place in the Bible, and I'm sorry I can't quote it exactly, where it says something like, you're first of all, you have good works that have been established for you from the beginning that you would walk in them. But then there's another place where it says, and these works are based on the calling of God and not on your qualifications. Right. And that's the thing. I'm not qualified. I'm not an East Asian Studies major. I don't speak Mandarin. Okay.
I love it. Because this is by the hand of God. He's knit it all together. Okay, I think this is amazing because I'm making notes as you're talking. So 2003, you're sick, and you're sick for the next 5 years. So it's now 2008, and you're sticking your foot in the realm of all this, and now all of a sudden you're the world's leading expert in what's going on in China. This is amazing. Okay, so keep on. What happens next?
Well, anyway, so then I established Women's Rights Without Frontiers, and we've done many things. As I said, we have the International Advocacy Campaign, and I should say that China just last week announced that it is considering abandoning the two-child policy. But see, the way that they word that makes it sound, again, like they're abandoning all coercive population control, but that's not what they're doing. So the point is that they said that they're doing this because of their rapidly aging population and because of international criticism.
Ooh.
International criticism. Well, who's been leading the international criticism? I mean, this makes me feel great, like we've really been heard. And the person who said this was an anonymous source who's either in or close to the Chinese Communist Party. And I'm sure that when he said international criticism, they probably came back and said, you know what, you shouldn't have said that, because our position is that we don't listen to international criticism. That's what they always say. We don't care what you say. You're interfering in our internal affairs, when actually they do care. They
Absolutely.
really care.
Oh, yeah, of course they do.
I'm seeing the international criticism, so I feel very happy about this move. But they haven't done it yet. And the problem with it is that what they said is the new rule is that all couples will be able to decide how many children they can have. All right? Well, what's wrong with that? I'll tell you what's wrong with it. Most of their abortions, at least according to them, are of single women. And they say nothing about single women being able to have children. Right? So,
but wait a minute, but they still consider that poor, rural, single woman who did not have the money for a marriage license, but she essentially is married, but they're considering her still single, right?
Right. I mean, that is one problem, and then there are other situations where she is clearly single, like
right, sure.
Like in the United States, people
right.
get pregnant, they didn't mean to. Fine, that you can't forcibly abort them.
Right. Okay.
But, I mean, 39.8% of the births in our nation are to single women. That's almost 40%. All of those would have been forcibly aborted in China. Although sometimes they will give the woman a choice. I spoke at the Heritage Foundation around this time last year with Congressman Chris Smith and a victim of forced abortion in China who was forcibly aborted at, I think, 6 or 7 months because she was single. And they gave her a so-called choice. And the choice was to pay, this enormous fine, which she could not afford. So people go to China, or the Chinese Communist Party in their official propaganda will say, well, if somebody gets pregnant illegally, they can pay a fine. What they don't say is that fine can be up to 10 times a person's annual salary. So think what you make in a year, multiply it by 10, and think about whether you could come up with that amount of money on an emergency basis to maintain a pregnancy.
Right.
Most people can't, and then they are forcibly aborted.
Well, let me ask you this. The women who do go into hiding, like your friend who testified to Congress, Wu Jian, yeah, so I mean, if they're successful and they have the baby in hiding, how do they bring that baby back into the community and not be busted?
Okay, so there if you can pay the fine, you can bring your baby back into the community, and it will get something called hukou, Hukou. Hukou is Chinese household registration. And if you do not have the money to pay the fine, you will bring your baby back in secret and raise your baby in secret without hukou. And what that means is that without hukou, a baby will not be able to have a birth certificate, will not be able to be educated, they will not be able to have health care, they will not be able to get a passport, they will not be able to officially work, they will not be able to officially marry. They are basically invisible, illegal people in their own land. And that's
my gosh.
what we also want to end the hukou system. So that's what happens to a lot of illegal babies.
Okay, the point I want to drive home here before we got to wrap it up for this segment is this comes down to worldview, and which is one of the big focuses of my show, is at the end of the day, no matter who you are, doesn't matter where you're at, everybody has a worldview, and everybody has to answer the same questions. Where do we come from? And what you're describing is the fallout, the consequences of a communist government. They're atheist run. They do not look at their citizens made in the image of God. They look at them as objects. They look at them as wards of the state. And I mean, just listen to this culture of death that you're describing, Reggie. And so, I mean, God must be smiling because you're shaking. I think you're making the earth spin in a different direction in a way with what you're doing with China. Okay, so before we break, tell us just a little bit, and we're going to cover it more when we come back. You had the opportunity. Actually, I didn't realize it was this late, so we're going to have to pick it up in the next segment. But in the next segment, we're going to ask Reggie how she ended up adopting a little Chinese baby girl. And we want to know all about it. So don't go anywhere. We're coming right back. We're going to be shining light in dark places.
Think back to the last time you felt healthy and energized. The best times of our lives occur when we're at the peak of our health, sleeping better, full of energy and focus. We know that fades with age, and you might be feeling the effects of aging as low energy and poor sleep. But it doesn't have to be that way. There haven't been any nutrition systems designed to rejuvenate our bodies as we get older until now. Healthy Cell Pro is the only multi-nutrient system that impacts the building block of your body, the cell. Created by anti-aging expert and Nobel Prize nominee, Dr. Vincent Giampapa. Award-winning Healthy Cell Pro cuts through the complexity of nutrition supplements by simply giving you the purest ingredients, filling dietary gaps to nourish your cells and enhance your quality of life for optimal performance. Visit healthycell.com and use code OUTLOUD for an exclusive discount or call 844-869-9958.
Okay, Reggie, we've saved the best for last. I really want to know, how in the world did you get connected with the young lady now, and you're going to have to tell me her name, but she was 10 years old when you became her legal guardian. What was the situation, and how in the world were you able to bring her back to the United States?
Well, okay, so she's the daughter of a famous dissident named Annie Lin. He was trained as a nuclear physicist and gave up what could have been a life of privilege to be a leader in the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy movement. And because of that, he's been in jail and tortured, in and out of jail and tortured for 16 years since 1989. And when the Chinese government could not silence him by directly jailing him and torturing him, they kidnapped his daughter, Annie, out of her fourth grade elementary school and detained her overnight, would not allow her to return to school, put her and her father under house arrest. So she's known as China's youngest prisoner of conscience.
Wow.
And they escaped house arrest, they became fugitives, and when they were caught, her father got word out to me saying, could you please bring Annie to the United States because she can't lead a normal life here. So with the help of some very brave people in China who helped Annie get out of China, and 3 or 4 of whom were detained and even tortured themselves, and also brave people in the United States, especially Congressman Chris Smith, we were able to get Annie and her older sister out of China, and we have been raising Annie as our own daughter ever since then.
So you're legal guardians of Annie. Okay, so how many years now have you had Annie?
It'll be 5 years this September, and something that's very wonderful about Annie is when she came to our home, we have a piano, and she just would she had no training, but she would just try to sound notes out on the piano over and over again, trying to sound tunes out. So I went to my husband and I said, look, why don't we get her piano lessons? She doesn't speak any English. It'll give her an outlet. We'll get her a Mandarin speaking piano teacher, and at least she'll have somebody in her life who speaks Mandarin, and she'll be able to take piano lessons, which is universal language. And let's get her piano lessons. So we got her piano lessons, and little did we know that the teacher that we gave, that became her piano teacher, his name is Matt Wong, is one of the top teachers in the country. And within 2 years, she won an international competition to perform in Carnegie Hall, and she performed in Carnegie Hall Christmas 2016. Isn't that?
Well, I'm just thinking here that God's smiling. He's smiling at all of this, and but a quick question though: is her father still in jail over in China?
her father got out of jail about a year and a half ago, and another big thing that I did is get him status to come to the United States, and he's now in the United States. So he's living in New York.
I see. Okay. Wow. What a blessing. What a blessing. Okay. Now, because I want to make sure we save time for this, explain to our listeners, what is the Save a Girl campaign and what's the Save a Widow campaign for the girls and widows over in China? What is all this about?
So the Save a Girl campaign has to do with the sex-selective abortion of baby girls. And this has to do with just brutal son preference in China, where especially second daughters are at risk. And it continues to be that way because even if they allow couples to have as many kids as they want, most couples don't want to have more than 1 or 2 kids because it's very expensive to have children in China. Mm-hmm. So they want their only child or one of their 2 children to be a boy. And what that does is that puts second daughters at very high risk of either sex-selective abortion or abandonment. And so this is for women. These women don't want to abort or abandon their babies. Okay, the pressure comes from either the mother-in-law usually, or their husband's grandparents, the grandparents. Mm-hmm. But it's a very intense pressure coming through the husband's side of the family to the woman to abort or abandon her baby girl. And we find out about these women because we have a network on the ground inside of China, and we'll go to their door and say, congratulations on your baby girl. Girls are as good as boys. Mm-hmm. Please don't abort or abandon her. And we will give you a monthly stipend for a year to empower you to keep your daughter. And these women have never heard anyone say that girls are as good as boys. I mean, that's just like not an unheard of message in rural China.
Wow.
Number one. So that's a big eye-opener to them. And then to offer them money every month as like a way to help them support their daughter, but also as a way to just extol the dignity of girls. And what it does is it enables them to use the culture around luck to save their daughters. They go to their mother-in-law and they say, I can't abort or abandon this baby girl. She's a lucky girl. Look, she's already bringing money into the family.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And we have saved hundreds of baby girls this way. And it's astonishing how little money it takes.
Well, I was just going to ask you, how much on average does it take to be able to...
we offer them, it's like $300 a year.
That's it? $300 a year? That's it?
$300 and to save a life in China.
Wow.
So people donate like $25 a month, and then and that's enough to help save a life in China. Oh. Now we put in, the organization puts in money to help to pay for the field worker and all of that. Mm-hmm. So anyway, and the woman herself gets about 160, 180 yuan a month, which is about $20 a month, and $5 goes to the field worker. But anyway, point is this: I don't know. I don't think that American organizations can say. I'm not going to make that comparison. I'm going to strike that. So yeah, it's about $300 a month to save a life in China, and these,
how many girls do you think you've saved so far since you implemented this?
Hundreds. We've saved hundreds.
Hundreds. Okay.
And the Save a Widow campaign is similar in structure, and it's the same network. So in the same little rural villages where we are in China, there are also these abandoned widows where their husbands may have died from something that's very expensive, like cancer. So what would happen is if a man gets a diagnosis like that, typically what will happen is that he and his wife will borrow money from everyone they know to try to get the chemotherapy. And then he'll get the chemotherapy, and then he will die anyway, leaving the widow with a mountain of debt. And these widows are abandoned by their children. The Chinese government does not have Social Security, so these widows are just impoverished. So I have one widow, for example, only before we were able to help her, she was eating only salt some days. And she had bought herself a rope to hang herself with when life got too tough. And this is the thing, is the unseen, the silent, the invisible victims of the one-child policy are the elderly, because
they have no families. I mean, God gives us children that's our social security. They have no social security.
That's exactly right. So the family structure has been destroyed. The family structure in rural China, farming families, used to be two parents would have, multiple children, and then those multiple children would have multiple children, and you have this big pyramid. And so that when the elderly couple gets old in need, you've got this enormous family to support them. It's not a problem. Okay. Now you've got a situation where you have an upside down pyramid of 4 grandparents to 2 parents to 1 child, and people just can't, the parent level just can't afford to be supporting their elderly parents and their child and themselves. Mm-hmm. And so these elderly are abandoned, and a lot of them are committing suicide. So they've seen this steep rise in senior suicide, and the suicide itself is really troubling. But also troubling is the way it's almost starting to be considered to be the normal way to die.
Oh my gosh! It's such a culture of death. I got a question though. I'm looking back on this timeline. When you had said under Mao, he was like, what was it, on average 6 babies per woman in China, but then under Deng Xiaoping, is that his name? Deng Xiaoping?
Deng Xiaoping, yes.
Okay, I can't pronounce it quite. Okay, and it went from 3 to 2 to 1. What decade did he come into power? Do you know? When did they start this child limit?
I cannot pinpoint exactly, when it was the 3 to 2 to 1, but I can pinpoint when the one-child policy started, which was in 1980. I think it was September.
Okay, that just
5th of 1980 is when the one-child policy officially started.
Okay, now at least it gives listeners an idea. They might not know you're talking 1920, 1850, but so 1980, one-child policy.
Yeah. Okay. No.
Okay. So 80 up to 2018. So, so we're talking now a number of decades. And did I hear you say there are 37 million more men in China?
Right. I mean, the estimates vary. So that's one estimate.
Whoa.
But yes, there's about 37 million more men than women living in China. And so what that's doing is it's driving human trafficking and sexual slavery, not only within China, but from the surrounding nations as well.
Wow. Okay. And which surrounding countries is that really prevalent at, or it's causing such a big problem?
Well, I mean, okay.
What are some of the other countries? I'm thinking
many other countries, including, for example, Vietnam, and then North Korea is the one that's really a big concern, because what happens is if human rights is worse anywhere else in the world than China, it's North Korea.
Okay.
And people escape over the border between North Korea and China, and it's considered to be treason by the North Korean government to escape North Korea. Right. So these young women and girls get snapped up into the sex slave trade, when they get into China. And they can't go to the Chinese authorities and say, look, I've been kidnapped, I'm being raped, I'm being abused. Because if they do, the Chinese authorities will just say, oh, you're an illegal economic migrant, and they'll repatriate them to North Korea against international refugee law, and then they can end up in one of these horrible concentration camps where they can end up dying. Wow. So that's a big problem, is sexual slavery from North Korea.
Okay. All right. Now, shifting over to something really positive, you had the opportunity to meet Mother Teresa. How and why did you get a chance to meet with her?
Well, I went to Calcutta twice, once in 85 and once in 88, to work with Mother Teresa. And it's actually not very hard to do, or at least wasn't in those days. You could just sort of show up at her doorstep, and the nuns would just bring you right in, and you could pick where you wanted to work. Mm-hmm. And I met her on a number of occasions, and she encouraged me to become a member of her order, which I probably would have if I had not just married my husband. He doesn't like to hear that, but If I had been unmarried, I think I probably would be a missionary of charity right now.
Oh, okay. So what was Mother Teresa like when you...
Oh my gosh. She was the most luminous person I've ever met in my life. So my husband and we could do a whole show on my memories of Mother Teresa.
Mm-hmm.
But just as an example, my husband and I had just walked in the door. We were sitting down on a bench outside their little teeny tiny office, waiting for them to give us a sheet of paper with the list of places they recommend to stay and the list of homes that we can work at. So we're just sitting there. We're just total non-entities sitting in the hallway. All of a sudden, I see this flurry of white to my right, and then all of a sudden, it's Mother Teresa herself.
Wow.
And she came up to Rob and me and pressed our hands and said, "Welcome, very good, very good. Welcome, very good, very good." One to each one of us, looking us in the eyes, personally welcoming us, taking our hands. She would put her hand under your hand and over your hand, very warm.
Mm-hmm.
And then whisking off into the private quarters. And we looked at each other and we was like, we can't believe that Mother Teresa herself. We'd been here for 5 minutes and we'd been personally welcomed by Mother Teresa. And it went from there. I mean, really, I have a lot of stories about working with her.
Well, tell us one more story. We have just enough time. What's another favorite story? I mean, did you ever work beside her? Like work beside her?
Well,
we're not quite working beside her, but
no. I mean, it was she. Okay, that's a long thing. But I'll tell you a favorite story. One favorite story is she encouraged the volunteers to go to mass in the morning, which was very early, like 5 or 6 in the morning, and then go to holy hour in the evening. And I went to holy hour. My first evening, I was late. Okay, so I walk into the chapel and I see Mother Teresa on the left in the back. Mm-hmm. I thought, okay, I'm going to sneak around the other side of the chapel. Hopefully she won't notice me that I'm late. All right. So I snuck around the other side of the chapel and knelt down with this rosary and didn't know where we were because I was late. And then I sensed this presence above me, and it's Mother Teresa. And she bends down and she shows me which bead we're on.
Oh my gosh. Oh.
And I thought to myself, okay, wow.
Oh.
Now I know I do not want to interrupt Mother Teresa's rosary. I need to be on time.
Oh my gosh.
and then afterwards, she invited me to become her apostle of the rosary. But that's a whole nother long story.
Oh,
so
okay. All right. Well, okay. I want to get back to action items. We have just enough time. Tell our listeners, if you could name 3 things you would want the listeners of this show to know or to do, what would you tell them, Reggie? What do they need to be doing?
Well, I mean, I would go on my website. So that's womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org, womensrightswithoutfrontiers.org. And I would ask you to click on the Save a Girl campaign button. That's the big button to the right. And right beneath it is the Save a Widow campaign button. And read about those campaigns. Mm-hmm. And I would also ask you to check out my blog. So we just posted a blog post about the move from a 2-child policy to whatever they're going to be doing, saying that all couples can have as many kids as they want. Mm-hmm. If you want to be up to speed on what's going on, the blog is the place to go. But if you want to actually do something, you can't. We're the only organization in the world, as far as I know, where you can actually get money to the doorstep of a woman who is either being pressured to abort or abandon her girl, or to a desperate widow who has no hope in the world other than the hope that we're bringing her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, those are three items right there. So the website, study up on Save a Girl and Save a Widow, read the blog, make a contribution. And, Reggie, God's chosen you. He's so clearly chosen you for such a time as this. And to me, it's like your big sparkle, because it's like how many people out there can have that kind of energy, that acumen to understand the law. So, clearly, God appointed you for such a time as this. So, Godspeed, safe travels, and I pray that you raise all the money you need to raise to help as many people as possible. And I pray, too, I hope that women in America, all women, even pro-choice women, that they will go to your website, study up on this. I hope they'll email you and give you a call to say, how can we help? You know, I mean, imagine if one movie star got behind what you're doing. One movie star, even if they came out and they said, I'm pro-choice, but forcing Chinese women into these abortions is just plain wrong, and a whole movement. I mean, I'm telling you, the world's going to start spinning in a different direction. So thanks for being on, Reggie.